Good evening, everybody. I'd like to call to order the regular meeting of the James City County Planning Commission. It is November 2nd, 2022 at 6 p.m. Mr. Holt, will you call the roll, please?
Mr. Rogers.
Here.
Mr. Rogers represents the Berkeley District. Ms. Knoll.
Present.
Ms. Knoll represents the Stonehouse District. Mr. Rose.
Here.
Mr. Rose represents the Roberts District. Mr. Polster.
Here.
Mr. Polster represents the Jamestown District and is Vice Chair of the Commission. Mr. Haldeman.
Here.
Mr. Haldeman is an at-large member. Mr. Kropp.
Here.
Mr. Kropp represents the Powhatan District. Mr. O'Connor.
Here.
Mr. O'Connor is an at-large member and is Chair of the Planning Commission. I'm Paul Holt, Director of Community Development and Planning. Sitting to my left is Ms. Liz Parman, our Deputy County Attorney. It's my pleasure to be Secretary to the Commission. Mr. Chair, we have a quorum.
Thank you, Mr. Holt. So, good evening, everybody. Just one quick housekeeping note this evening. When we get to public hearings, we're going to have AFD 22-0017 and SUP 22-0015. The AFD withdrawal and the Pivot Energy solar project as one public hearing this evening. So it'll be a little bit easier for staff and for the Planning Commission to have the discussion. And then there'll be three separate votes on this tonight. One is the AFD withdrawal, the second is the SUP, and then the third is compliance with the comprehensive plan for James City County. So first item on our agenda this evening is public comment. This is time that is set aside for anybody who wishes to address the Planning Commission on anything germane to planning, but not included in the public hearings tonight. So is there anybody that wishes to speak? Hearing and seeing none, we will move on to reports of the Commission. We had no DRC or Policy Committee meetings last month. We'll be moving to November for sure for Policy Committee, and I assume DRC as well, so we will have reports in December for that. One item on our consent agenda this evening, minutes of the October 5th, 2022 regular meeting. So I'll look for a motion to approve.
Motion to approve.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to recuse myself from this vote because I was not at that particular meeting.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
Same.
I'm sorry?
Same.
Okay. So we will have two abstentions, but we have a motion to approve. All in favor?
Aye.
This motion carries with Dr. Rose and Mr. Kropp
And I'm
abstaining.
showing that as a 5-0 vote with 2 abstentions.
Correct.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our first public hearing this evening will be AFD-22-0017, 7294 Richmond Road, Hill Pleasant Farm, AFD withdrawal, and SUP-22-0015, 7294 and 7296 Richmond Road, Pivot Energy Solar Project. Mr. Wysong, good evening, and thanks for pitch hitting.
My pleasure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good evening to the Commission. Mr. Buzz Becker of Pivot Energy has applied for a special use permit to construct a solar farm on an approximately 64.9 acre portion of parcels located at 7294 and 7296 Richmond Road. The parcels are zoned A1 General Agricultural and designated Economic Opportunity on the 2045 Comprehensive Land Use Map and are located outside of the primary service area. The property located at 7296 Richmond Road is not located within an AFD. The property located at 7294 Richmond Road is currently within the Hill Pleasant Farm AFD. As part of the 2022 AFD renewal process, the owner withdrew 42 acres of that property from the AFD for the solar farm use. After the renewal period closed, the applicant recognized the need to withdraw an additional 10 acres from the AFD to allow for stormwater facilities on the site, and this withdrawal does require board approval because it occurred after the renewal period closed. Withdrawal requests outside of the renewal period are considered per the criteria listed in the Board of Supervisors policy governing the withdrawal of properties from AFDs. The criteria are that the request is caused by a change in circumstances that could not have been anticipated at the time application was made for the inclusion in the district, and staff has historically interpreted that as the death of a property owner. The request would serve a public purpose, as opposed to the proprietary interest of the landowner that could not otherwise be realized upon expiration of the AFD. staff interprets a public purpose as using the land for a public facility such as school or fire station. The request would not cause damage or disruption to the existing district, and staff finds the AFD would continue to meet the minimum acreage requirements if this withdrawal is approved. And if the request for withdrawal is in conjunction with a proposal to convert the land use of a property to a different use than is currently placed on the property, the new land use would be in conformance with the comprehensive plan. And solar farms are not specifically identified as a compatible land use in the economic opportunity designation, but they may serve as a transitional land use until market forces determine a more intense economic use. As such, staff finds that this application would not cause a disruption to the AFD and that the proposed land use would be a transitional use within the EO designation. However, staff does find that this proposal is not caused by an unforeseen change in circumstance and that this request would not serve as a public purpose. Since this does not meet all the criteria for the board's withdrawal policy, staff recommends denial of this withdrawal request to the Board of Supervisors. At its October 20th meeting, staff presented this recommendation and information to the AFD Advisory Committee. The committee unanimously recommended approval of this withdrawal request by a vote of 7-0. Regarding design, the proposed solar farm facility will consist of ground-mounted arrays of solar panels mounted on single-axis trackers to orient the arrays toward the direction of the sun. All new utilities will be placed underground, and the solar farm will connect to an existing overhead utility lines on the property. The applicant has stated that the lease will be for 21 years, with an option to extend the lease for an additional 10 years. Staff has proposed conditions to mitigate the impacts from this proposal. These proposed conditions will require access to the facility during construction and decommissioning to be from the existing easement along the railroad connecting to Peach Street. Once the site construction is complete, normal-sized vehicles can access the site from Richmond Road, but oversized vehicles are still required to utilize the Peach Street entrance. Construction activities such as pile driving, clearing, and grading have limited hours per the SUP conditions. Furthermore, a 50-foot vegetated buffer is shown along the perimeter of the development, with this buffer being increased to 75 feet along areas nearest to Richmond Road and residences. I will note there's a minor typo in condition number 5B, which means to reference the landscaping requirement in 5C, but currently states 6C. This will be corrected prior to the next public hearing. The 2045 Comprehensive Plan Land Use Map designates the property economic opportunity, and the comprehensive plan does not specifically identify solar farms as a compatible use in EO. Therefore, staff has reviewed this application as a transitional use given the limited lease of the property. According to Virginia State Code 15.2-223T2, unless a utility facility is shown on the adopted comprehensive plan or other master plans for the county, the local planning commission and a governing body shall review the facility to determine whether the location, character, and extent of the project is substantially in accord with the comprehensive plan. Staff recommends the Planning Commission find this application consistent with the 2045 Comprehensive Plan and does recommend approval of the SUP to the Board of Supervisors, subject to the proposed conditions upon the approval of the withdrawal request from the AFD. And I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have, and the applicant team is here tonight, and I believe they also have a presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Weissong. Any questions? Mr. Krupp?
Good evening, Mr. Weissong, and some of these may have to go to the applicant. Looking at the AFD withdrawal request, I note that the 42 acres were pulled during the open window for the AFD adjustment, but then very shortly after that closed, the additional 10 acres was requested, and from what I was reading through the material, the additional 10 acres are due to master plan changes for stormwater and buffering. Could you elaborate on that? Were these revelations that came forward at the last minute? Was this through the entire master plan process? How did this all come about?
I will defer to the applicant on the exact specifics, but I believe during the review process with staff working with the applicant, it was determined that some more acreage was needed, as you had said, for the stormwater facilities and to expand a little bit of the area for the solar farm.
And so then, therefore, that's still not considered a circumstance beyond the applicant's available knowledge or information at the time they submitted the request for the additional 10 acres?
Good question. Because it was outside of the renewal period, I don't believe we treated it that way, and we just stuck with the four criteria.
Not to monopolize it, can I also transition to a discussion about access to the site from Peach Street during construction? I drove around there the other day, and I may have been looking at the wrong areas, but I would be curious to see where the access from Peach Street is, and then also maybe have the applicant address whether the drooping utility lines on adjacent properties would pose a problem for the heavy equipment they'll be using.
Sure, and I do think we have a map prepared that shows the access from Peach Street.
Mr. Crop, while we're working to get that exhibit pulled up, I know the applicant's team will do a much better job articulating some of the nuances of the stormwater management plan at a very high level. As I've been tracking it, there's sort of two substantive pieces that have come into play more recently, especially in the context of, say, the previous three that the commission, the previous ones that the commission has considered. One, there's been an evolution in thought at the state level as to how to calculate impervious cover on solar farms. And the current guidance from the state and some of the current standards that are currently under consideration are now considering the panels themselves to be impervious cover versus just being the poles that go into the actual ground. And so from a stormwater management master plan point of view, obviously the amount of land that is then needed to build into the stormwater management plan to account for that much impervious surface grows quite a bit. And I believe sort of at the beginning of the process, there were some assumptions made as to the amount of forested land that could be credited towards the stormwater management master plan. And as those discussions continued with the Stormwater Resource Protection Division, I believe it's been our longstanding interpretation of state code and how we implement Chesapeake Preservation Act to put a cap on the amount of forested land that could be used as a component of a stormwater master plan. And you know, as you can imagine, you mix those two things together and all of a sudden you don't have as much forested land as you wanted,
Right.
but you've got to treat a whole lot more impervious. And I think, you know, again, at a very high level, they'll do a better job explaining some of those nuances. But at that point, it became clear they needed additional land outside of the AFD with which to refine their stormwater management master plan.
Thank you, Mr. Holm. Yep. That was a good pause for Mr.
Yeah, it worked
Wysong
out
to
pretty
get the
well
map
that
up
you
there.
asked
You
two
have
separate
the tag
questions.
team here, okay.
All right, so I'm trying to get the mouse to work here. The access road is shown, it's the yellow dashed line. The subject property is highlighted in red. And you can see how it runs parallel to the railroad track.
Oh, yeah. Mhm.
Yes, thank you.
And they won't have to do any road improvement or anything else to get their equipment onto that site?
So there's a condition in place that would require them to do an existing conditions analysis of that roadway as well as the other roadways that are connected to it. And then they would do an assessment of the state of the road and calculate what the repairs would be. And those repairs would have to be completed after the site's finished.
That assessment would include the ability to clear utility lines and all that sort of thing, so I assume.
It would assess any damages caused or impacts from the site. Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Weiss.
Again, Mr. Crop, members of the commission, just add another little layer of detail in that. So again, I know the applicant team will address this specifically. So To the best of my knowledge and belief, Peach Street and Peninsula are contained within the portion of secondary roads that are maintained by VDOT. Once you cross over the railroad tracks, I believe you start to begin more of a shared easement type of situation that's not maintained by VDOT. And then certainly coming over the railroad tracks and hooking that hard right, I believe I saw there was a separate picture. I'm not sure any of that is improved. If, at best, it may be a dirt path.
Yeah.
And certainly to support tractor trailers, heavy construction equipment, that'll need to be improved.
I think you're right. I had the same reaction that it was definitely not improved road. Yeah.
Snow?
So, Mr. O'Connor, that was my concern too. I drove out there. I went on Peninsula Street, which is very narrow, all residential. Then you go up the railroad tracks and you're kind of sitting like this. Then you go down and their access road that they're planning is immediately to the right. They're saying they're going to take the big equipment in through that way. How do they make a 45-degree turn? I don't understand. And it's heavily treed, as Mr. Kraft had in his pictures. And my understanding is the other part of the solar farm that's been there for a while had access off of Rochambeau Road. You know, and it looks like it still goes through there. Is there any way they could come from there? Or, better yet, closer down here on Richmond Road, right where they would come into the existing one as well, instead of all that heavy equipment going down there, all the noise, the tearing up the road, and then you get on to Peach Street, which is dirt. You know, I think it's horrible. I think it's not well thought out as far as the access. And a couple times I read, they said access would be restricted to 60 at part times and then restricted to Peach Street. It doesn't really say what it's going to do. And I just think if one of those great big things gets stuck on that railroad track, it's over. I mean, CSX is out of business. So I think we've got to find another way in there or not at all.
And I can just speak to the conditions staff's put together for, the entrance off of Richmond Road. It is so abrupt. I mean, on the site
I
visit,
understand,
yeah, and that was part of the thinking for conditioning those larger vehicles to have a different access point. As to other access possibilities, I can certainly defer to the applicant to
Well,
explain.
I drove down Rochambeau and I thought, why can't they go in here? I mean, there's,
So one of the challenges on that one, Ms. Knoll, that's separate and distinctly different than the solar farm to the south. That one had a lot of frontage on Rochambeau that was on developable land. I think there are two existing situations that at least stand out for me that on these properties do not make, for this type of traffic, that do not lend themselves very well, if at all, to access out onto Rochambeau, and that is, I don't know if we picked it up on this one or the other location map. On the other end of this property, while there does appear to be a driveway-like access that seems to cut through, it passes a number of residential lots on the other end, and also on the Rochambeau end. That entire frontage is fully encumbered with environmentally sensitive areas in RPA. There is no open land there that existed on the other one. So that's
okay,
a
thank you,
pretty big distinction for sure.
thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. Weissong? Ms. Krupp?
Just one other one, and this applies to, in a sense, all of the solar farm applications we've seen, but one condition in all of them talks about the responsibility of the owner of the solar panels to dispose of them properly at the end of the lease period. My question is, from an enforcement standpoint, if a company goes under for whatever reason and they're no longer viable, whose responsibility is it to dispose of the panels unless there's a surety bond or some sort of an account set up that would handle that if the company itself went out of business?
Yes, sir. In condition 15, we do have a requirement that a surety bond would have to be
Okay.
posted to cover that in case someone went out of business or a property owner passed away. We would
Okay.
have the money to decommission the site and remediate the site as well.
Thank you. I missed that particular component. Thank you.
Bolster?
I brought up the same point with the county attorney's office, and the issue on the decommissioning site is that when you're looking at a 21 or a 30-year time frame, there's an escalation in the costs associated with it, which are more than. So as I understand it, part of the conditioning is that there's a relook at that surety bond to make sure that it will cover the decommissioning costs, let's say 25 or 30 years from now. For it, which I think is a smart thing to do.
Any other questions for Mr. Weissong? Thank you, sir. At this point, I'd like to open the public hearing. Mr. Becker?
Good evening. My name is Buzz Becker. I'm here representing Pivot Energy on behalf of the applicant. I have a presentation we're pulling up right now. I'm going to be speaking to the three considerations before the Planning Commission tonight. First, starting off with the AFD withdrawal recommendation. Second, moving on to the special use permit. And third, going on to the 2232 determination. So before we get started, just to share a little bit about Pivot Energy that I think is important and maybe give some context about kind of the long-term prospects. So these size of projects, these kind of 5 megawatt projects or less, is something that we're a national leader in. Years of experience, hundreds of these projects nationally and clients, and specifically community solar. And I think that's different than the other projects that have been before you. Insofar as these are projects that we are going to be able to subscribe local James City County residents to get a discount on their electricity for something new to Dominion, and something that we're very excited about. I'm based here in Virginia. A company has a footprint in many states across the country, but I've been developing projects here in Virginia since 2017. We are a certified B Corporation. I think, again, this matters when we talk about as the project company, who are you working with? It's a company that holds itself to high standards from impact on the environment, society, and how we are governed, with a long track record of investing hundreds of thousands of dollars into the communities that we develop. And it's all driving towards that triple bottom line philosophy of people, planet, and profit. Here's a wrinkle that I think is actually really important when thinking about from an operational standpoint. Certainly we've already talked in the discussion among the commissioners about concern about what are some of those intricacies, some of those details about how this project will be pulled off. When we propose conditions for this permit tonight, when we work with county staff to get those conditions right, we are the long-term owner and operator of the project, and so we will be the entity that you hold accountable for fulfilling these conditions as a part of the permit. So, there's many different ways to do solar. I think everyone has their place in industry, but whereas someone else might develop a project and sell it to someone else, and then, who are you going to be talking to actually make sure the standards are upheld? It will be Pivot Energy, and I think that matters. Next slide, please. All right. Again, tried to kind of queue these up in the three different considerations for you tonight. First, starting with the AFD withdrawal. I first here in that next slide have an exhibit just for the frame of reference, and there was some discussion about the amount of acreage that was pulled out during the open enrollment period. And again, and I'll be referencing this later as we look through the 4 criteria, this intention for this withdrawal was to maintain the maximum amount of acres in the district out of respect for the district, while being able to design a site that upheld the conditions that had been precedented in James City County. And so you'll see just a little bit more of what we need around our existing most recent withdrawal a few months ago, and we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. Next slide, please. I'm sure you could all recite these in your sleep. So here are the 4 AFD withdrawal criteria. I'm not going to hit these in order, actually. I'm going to hit these in order of simplicity and maybe most agreement between ourselves, county staff, and the AFD committee down kind of the spectrum there. So next slide, please. Starting with criteria C. This one is simple math. Very straightforward. If our AFD withdrawal request were to be approved, the district would not be threatened in any way, would still have its minimum acreage. In addition, our landowner has indicated an interest and willingness to submit some acreage to offset this additional withdrawal from that northern parcel that's not today in the AFD. just as a sign of good faith, and you should have seen that landowner intent within our withdrawal submission. So clearly this criteria is met. Next slide, please. Yeah, next slide, please. And we do agree with the planning staff and the committee there. So going back to criteria D, it should be the slide before this. Yeah, there we go. Again, we agree with the planning staff and the AFD committee here. The proposed land use needs to be in conformance with the comp plan. We are in the economic opportunity zone. We have a property immediately to our south that has the same use that we are proposing here today, and the planning staff has recommended approval of our proposed SUP and a finding of comp form compliance. So clearly this criteria is met. Next slide, please. Criteria B, we differ a little bit with the planning staff here, but do agree with the AFD committee. The staff provided a public purpose definition, but limited it to just a public facility as a school or a fire station. I think implicitly this could mean that an AFD withdrawal could only be for a public entity, and I don't think that's right. The concept of public purpose actually comes from federal regulations, as you see before you there, and it includes certainly providing facilities, but also services for the benefit of the public in connection but not limited to public health, safety, or welfare. So not only are we bringing or proposing a project that delivers infrastructure investment, but also offers meaningful utility bill savings, particularly to low to moderate income people, really the focus of the majority of this project. So we agree with the AFD committee that this criteria was met. And then finally, and this is going to Commissioner Kraft's question about kind of the timeline of how this came out. We differ from the planning staff in terms of the kind of the only definition of an unplanned or unanticipated circumstance change being the death of a property owner. Again, when we submitted that withdrawal request, this was based on trying to keep the maximum amount of acres in the AFD. At the same time, that site plan that we had put before county staff that we were working was in full compliance of the Board of Supervisors approved conditions for your most recent solar project, just back in March. So those approved conditions were only a couple months old at that time. We were aware of state conversations with DEQ about new approaches to stormwater management. At the time, and even still today, those are not enacted. Those are draft guidelines. In fact, most of the implementation, if not all of the implementation guidelines that have been offered with regard to those new regulations, at least up until this point, would not apply to our project. There was a concept of grandfathering in that had to do with when your interconnection process started. All of that's still very much up in the air. The main kicker that you should know, going to the gentleman's question about timeline, our submission for withdrawal was finalized on July 22nd. We did not receive these new conditions as proposed by staff until August 29th. So over a month after the door was shut for us to pull any more acres out, and we could have pulled the whole property out. We very much did not want to do that. But over a month later, that was the first time we saw what staff was proposing for those conditions, which, next slide, please. No problem. We've had a great working relationship with staff, had many calls where we've been trying to refine our site plan, meet all of their intent and really try to make everyone happy about the best way to design this project. But it certainly couldn't have been done with those conditions only being proposed to the applicant a month after the window was closed. And so this clearly constitutes a change in circumstance that could not have been anticipated at the time. And we agree with the AFD committee that this criteria was met. Going on to your second consideration tonight, we are talking about the SUP recommendation. Next slide, please. I have here just as a reference point, certainly it's a site plan you've seen very much before. It seems like the majority of the conversation is around that Peachtree access. I want to speak to maybe a couple things with the project that we think is a very excellent design, and then maybe touch on that Peach Street one a little bit more. So of our own kind of volition, we reached out to all of our immediate abutters to get feedback about our project, and the only ones we heard from were the two Campbells, just north of the northernmost part of our fields, and they were the two that showed up to our community meeting and had a great conversation, have had more calls and emails after that than I can even keep track of this time, and in engaging with them, had made tweaks to our site plan to try to be mindful of community input there. One of which being, if you see that vegetative buffer that's at the northern edge of our parcel, That's actually not the most common place to put a vegetative buffer, as you probably know. It's typically put on your parcel boundary, but we pulled that back in consultation with county staff and confirmation with the compliance there because because the landowners said, hey, we love that open space that we can see today. Is there any way you can develop this property such that, hey, we still need to buffer it. We still need to not only meet county standards on that buffer, but exceed it, as was probably touched on earlier. But how can we still have that great open space that we love to look at today? No problem. That's something that we incorporated into our plan. Another thing with regard to that access path, and we've been in kind of ongoing conversation with the Campbells on that, is making sure that as we sort out, and of course this is not necessarily during the special use permit process, but more during the site plan review process, is getting into the nitty-gritty about the construction level designs of that access path through that existing easement that the property owner does have today. They have that affirmed easement through which they do today bring in large agricultural vehicles today. And we said, hey, how can we work with you? Can we plant additional trees there so we're obscuring your view of that construction access easement? Can we make sure that you're aware anytime we're going to have a vehicle on there? Can we talk about limits on the times of day and the days of the week so that we are minimizing the impact? And of course, it's just the 3 months or so during construction. The vast majority of the time, any vehicle comes to this property as a result of the project, and something we really push staff on, said we want as much as possible to go on Richmond Road. Of course, because it is a great CSX berm that is a great view shed obscuration, we'll touch on that maybe a little bit here in a sec, not every vehicle can do that, and we recognize that. But we think that with very thoughtful planning, with our construction traffic management plan that we've set out, and in consultation with VDOT, there is absolutely a way, and we know there's a way because large agricultural trucks use that route today. And so whatever it takes in consultation with the other neighbors along Peach Street, in consultation with county staff, we believe there's a way and want to allow the landowner to utilize the construction easement that they do have there. What's great about this project too is you have it on 2 properties, and the northern part is 1 megawatt, the southern part is 3.75 megawatts, and we're looking to power enough for approximately 400 homes here in James City County. Again, you see the vegetative buffer to the west, in addition to the berm there. And as some of you sounds like you've been out to the site, hopefully you've been across Richmond Road too. This thing is hidden. I mean, once it's built, you're never going to hear from it. It's just going to bring clean power, utility bill discounts, and tax revenue to James City County. So we're very excited about it. Next slide, please. I'll just hit on this really quick. Y'all are experts. You've seen a million site plans at a satellite view, but just to appreciate scale, that's a at-scale football field between the edge of that perimeter fence of the project and not even quite the parcel boundary between the Campbells and the Chong property, just to show how far set back. And that was not something in our first draft. Our first draft was not quite that set back, but in consultation further set that back. Next slide, please. Real quick, this is this summer in between crops this year, what the view shed of this property looks like from that boundary. You'll see at the top a kind of schematic representation of the planned vegetative buffer. As you know, with your own code here, it is a mix of shrubs and trees. We are proposing to exceed that through increased percentage of evergreen and proposing 8 feet tall evergreen trees at the time of planting. I'm sure you've seen solar projects where, yeah, it's great, you might have a proposed buffer, but it's a shrub today. It's not doing any hiding of anything. And that's very much the difference here. What I tried to show, and you can see, do I have a mouse here? Yeah, I should, huh? No, it's not really moving for me. Okay. So this edge of the tree here, and I'll point up here so you can kind of see, if you just remember the slide we were just on, this is the northern limits of what we're proposing for that project boundary here, right in that tree outcropping. So that's effectively right there. That is where the panels start. So that far in the rear ground, nothing here in the foreground. That's going to be maintained as that open space for anyone to enjoy the view there. So the panels are all back there. And for scale, this was a picture that I took with my midsize SUV at that same location. So again, edge of that tree, northern edge of that array, and that's what a midsize SUV looks like. Again, before a 75-foot deep buffer with 8 feet tall evergreen trees at the time of planning. So this is a rough digital rendering trying to show, hey, certainly year 10, this is going to be super robust. And we are having, as a condition, you should have seen that all of the species in consultation with the planning director will be native to this area, will be pollinating insofar as that makes sense, and will certainly contribute to the existing character of the community. And we are exceeding county regs on depth, percentage of evergreen, and how tall they're going to be day one. So talking about the benefits this project would bring to the county, this project is offering a 20% discount to local Dominion customers, particularly interested in finding those low to moderate income customers who are most budget burdened by high utility bills. That's going to be 3/4 of the project, and so it's going to that lower, larger section is what's able to do that. When I think about an average Dominion customer, I mean, that's up to $600 a year for 30 years. I mean, we're talking about, within James City County alone, almost $200,000 saved utility bills every year for the life of the project. We're excited about that. You know that these projects, even the ones you've seen before that are not shared solar, bring real economic development, certainly a large uptick in revenue from the property without offsetting fiscal obligations, lots of investment. And we do have, as a condition, commitment to hosting job fairs in James City County for the positions created. And perhaps in support of this being a great place for an economic opportunity development, it's temporary. Going to Commissioner Kraft's point about decommissioning, when we put that security up for the decommissioning of the project, that security has to also be in favor of the county. So if anything were to happen to Pivot and the project needed to be removed, or something were to happen and we were not fulfilling the conditions of our permit, the county could call on that decommissioning security and already have the finances provided by Pivot Energy to remove it and restore that property. So it's a huge safeguard, and something I would presume previous of your projects have as well. And of course, this is going to be up to 30 years where the soil is resting, that will have a natural and pollinating ground cover and buffer species, and avoiding more intense developments. And certainly I'm not before you speculatively tonight. We've tried to do a lot of work before I even get in front of you. And so that includes our first phase of interconnection being done, where we have reasonable confidence that the project can financially support any upgrades. We have already delineated the wetlands, and those are before your regional Army Corps representative for confirmation. There are no known critical wildlife habitats, and the FAA has given us a determination of no hazard. We're already wrapping up our ALTA survey in the next couple of weeks, and would be beginning the geotechnical survey and cultural historical survey later this month to ensure that there are no impacts along those lines. And here's your prospective timeline. This has changed a little bit since when I first submitted the packet, knowing that we had a couple months deferral, but if we were able to move forward tonight, we would tentatively be planning on site plan review in Q2 of next year, with the hope that all phases of interconnection study with Dominion are done in Q3 of 2023. Of course, that's not fully up to us, but that's what we're tracking right now. Our intent would be to construct soon to commence construction soon thereafter, and the first phase to begin commercial operations Q1 2024. Almost done for you. So going on to consideration number 3, our 2232 review. This is the last slide that I'm going to have in front of you tonight. You understand this process, its location, its character, and extent. The location is great in that it's a transitional, low-impact use and economic opportunity, so that at the end of the useful life, either it can be returned to agricultural use, or if the landowner and county agree upon a future use that is not solar, is something else at the time, that's great. And it's outside the PSA, knowing that this is a good fit because this type of development doesn't need the type of services that you typically see in the PSA. And so in our submission, you should have seen in more detail where, based on location, we meet comprehensive plan goals, land use 1.1, 4.7, and public facilities 4.5. From a character standpoint, it is unique in how set back behind that CSX berm it is impossible to see. Certainly robust buffers and native pollinators help with that. So community character 1.1, 3.2, environmental 4.61, and 4.62 are met. And extent, certainly it's a passive low impact use with meaningful investment in the county, and meeting transportation 1.2, 3.6, public facility 2.3, and community character 6.1. And with that, I will take any questions from the commission.
Mr. Becker, any questions? Mr. Polster?
I've got a couple. Can you describe to me from the northern boundary where you have that 75-foot buffer? And then the land that then extends all the way to the property line adjacent to the Campbells?
Yeah.
What is going to happen there?
So we've committed to the Chong property, or to the Chong family, to pay them for that land. And so it's potentially just going to be an open pollinating meadow. We don't expect a section of that size to be in active agriculture, but we're still in the ideation phase. Basically, we said, hey, we are committing to this to be a part of essentially the permit area, if you will. And so to maintain that natural view space or the view shed for the Campbells, we want to say, hey, let's talk about what makes sense there. But today we anticipate a pollinating meadow.
You talk about what the ground cover is going to be underneath the panels.
Excuse me, underneath?
Underneath the panels.
Underneath the
ground cover.
panels, yep. So that is going to be a native pollinating seed mix that is underneath the panels. We would anticipate a mow about once every quarter. And so it's going to be in consultation with the planning director about what makes sense from a local pollinating mix, but that's going to be just that ground cover there. So it'll be vegetated.
You just confused me because you said you were going to do quarterly maintenance and mowing.
Correct.
In your paper, you talked about doing it twice a year, once in the spring and once in the fall. Is that a change?
No, I would say up to a quarterly, but between 2 to 4 times a year is what I would say.
Well, I wanted to compliment you because it's the
Sure.
first time we've seen a solar farm that really has looked at the maintenance. I just wish that could be a condition, but I think there was other ways at the site plan that the staff can handle that. But I do want to commend you for going to school on the race field and your outreach to the Campbells on that, especially on the access road. The last question is can you give me some idea of the biggest truck that's going to be going down Peachtree City in terms of, I guess it's going to be hauling the panels?
Yeah.
Can you give me some idea what that's going to look like? Is it a tractor trailer?
That's essentially what it'll be. And it'll just be for that delivery of the panels. But the vast majority of any kind of traffic through that area will not be vehicles of that size.
So a flatbed, is that
That's right.
about
A low boy. That's
So
right.
you wouldn't have too much of a problem going from on one side of the railroad track to the other, as I understand that bend that I've been out there, than
Sure.
with a tractor trailer at all.
Very doable, and like the gentleman with the county staff said, this is something that will be surveyed ahead of time, and so this is something that can be sketched out that is a part of our construction traffic transportation plan.
I guess the last piece is that I wanted to make sure is your coordination with the Campbells. Is I sent you the pictures with the shrubbery along that access route.
Yep.
And you've been talking with them already about what type of plantings you may put in there. Is that correct?
That's right. So there may potentially be some trimming that's needed to be done, as that we would anticipate that being augmented, but have been in consultation and say, hey, show us the areas you're most concerned about that we could potentially plant similar to our vegetative buffer. Where can we plant such that you're okay with that? And it's just an ongoing dialogue, and that's the difference for us being the long-term owner and operator.
Well, like I said, I was pleased with the coordination you did with the Campbell because I think, 2 years ago, we approved a tourist home application for those 2 lots. And so the fact that you've taken the opportunity to make sure that that viewscape is not going to be, and it's going to be in pollinators, is a great addition. Thank you.
Dr. Rose?
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. Could you briefly explain how the subscription service works and
Yeah.
how you identify low to medium income subscribers?
Yeah, and so we have our own proprietary platform called Sun Central, where it's actually we manage subscribers through local utilities through that. And so what this typically looks like, and this is an open conversation in Virginia, whether it will be a consolidated bill with Virginia or if it will be a separate bill on which their Dominion account gets a bill credit from subscribing to our account, and then they get a separate invoice from us, where essentially they're netted out for that difference. But in terms of outreach to low-income subscribers, I mean, this is the one that we'd be excited to talk to local leaders. Maybe it's public housing experts here in the area, nonprofit leaders who are engaged in those communities. We want to kind of reach them authentically, knowing that I might not know all those people today. We have a kind of a manager of subscriptions who partners with localities on that. And so I would say I don't have that vetted plan for you today, but would be a part of the process for sure.
So, I apologize for being naive. It doesn't mean that they just have to be people who live around the solar farm. They're not just connecting.
Correct.
You supply energy back to Dominion and it comes back out, but they can subscribe to you through some process. Okay.
We certainly being mindful of, and the way I think about it in solar projects often, we try to mitigate all impacts, but there are local impacts and then disperse benefits, right? And so trying to get as many of those local abutters as we can, and even saying, hey, can I give you maybe an even better rate? Can I like really work with you and seek you out? That's a big priority for us, but it is broader than that, yes.
Mr. Rogers?
I have a question about the stormwater management piece, which, and the additional 10 acres.
Yep.
And everyone wants good stormwater management.
Yeah.
So great. My question is there just absolutely one way to achieve this particular stormwater management and it requires 10 acres, or are there, say, more expensive ways to do it with less than taking 10 acres out of the AFD? What I'm looking at is, at least locally here, when Dominion put those towers across the James River, like everyone agreed we needed to get power from our side of the river to the other side of the river.
Yeah.
Not everyone agreed that it couldn't go like under the water as opposed to over the water. And so, like, I understood the change and that now you need to address it. But I was just curious, for instance, if the AFD withdrawal was denied, are there engineers that would say, now we have to do this with less acreage, or is it one way?
So I'm very glad that I brought some of my project team colleagues here. I'm going to defer to my colleague from Kimley Horn, who's our stormwater expert. In fact, and I'm not even going to try to give you the bottom line up front. I'm just going to defer to her.
Well, and just as he comes up, I might be able to pose the question easier. I guess what I was thinking was, if AFD withdrawal is denied, did your project just stop? Because you can no longer manage the stormwater. So that's...
So Nick Robertson with Kimley Horn. So in working back and forth with the staff and the changes with the draft DEQ guidance that came out, which is not in effect yet, the county has decided to go ahead and take that draft guidance and assume that it will be implemented as is. So if that happens, that mainly affects us from a quality standpoint on removing the nutrients. And it's really only an issue during construction, but because the measures needed to remove the nutrients for quality purposes have to be larger basins, and that requires more areas. So if those requirements stay in place with the county and we did not get extra acreage, we would either have to decrease the amount of panels or not do the project. And there's only a certain limit to which you can decrease your project before Dominion says you have to go back in the queue. And I don't think that we could decrease the production for the panels on this project.
Excuse me, I was going to say, not to the degree that would be required.
Just as a clarification.
Yes, sir.
Is when you did your coordination with the staff and the staff engineers from the stormwater people, they gave you, you told them what the size of the project was going to be, and then they threw it through a spreadsheet that computed everything out, that determined what the size of your BMP requirements. Am I correct?
We did those calculations ourselves. Normally, that's not done at this stage of the project. Normally, you make an assumption, but our first assumption and our first site plan went off of, I think, Racefield's conditions, where you could use a percentage of conserved open space to offset that. And so based on the things that changed throughout the process, Megan ran those calculations. We determined where we would need basins and how large they would need to be, and it increased the size that we
And
needed.
what was the comments to your change in engineering approach from the stormwater folks? Did they agree with your calculations? Sorry?
Yes.
So there wasn't any alternative?
Not without decreasing the amount of productivity of the site, which we don't intend to be able to do.
Right, thank you.
But as a follow-on to that, is there a part of the parcel to the northern side, which will either be the meadow or is not in the AFD, that could have been used for stormwater management so as not to require the withdrawal?
Well, it's really based off topography. So you've got to place those basins in areas where the water is draining to. So you could potentially move panels up to that section, but I don't know that it would be to the extent that it would make a big difference, and it would be detrimental to the Campbells. So we were trying to balance those issues.
Commissioner O'Connor, to the extent that those additional acres are needed, we don't even have enough of those acres in that maintained meadow. Even if we were to change and go up to the property boundary with that 75-foot buffer, there just aren't enough acres there to offset. Especially because those wooded acres up to the north are wet, and we're trying not to touch those.
I guess my last point, and I just want to make sure we're clear about it, is when the county staff decided to go ahead and implement what will eventually be in 2024, the DEQ policy, when that finally gets vetted and all the rest of it. What was really driving that, as I understand it, and I'd like to make sure that I'm straight on that, was the amount of impervious surface associated with those panels. And so the computations that you went through are based on the amount of water coming off of those and where it drains to, which is why you had to have those basins located where they were. Is that correct?
I can get a stormwater question, so I get excited to step in. So not only that, Commissioner Polster, but they are considering the full square footage of that panel as if it were looking straight up. And as you know, these tilt, and that's just not how these panels behave. So, and we're meeting that requirement, but to your point.
Which is why I asked what type of a ground cover, because there's been studies that said that that drip thing off, which is what Yonkin thinks is the problem, isn't a problem when you have a vegetated cover underneath there, and especially if it's maintained on a quarterly basis. So once again, I think it's a really good engineering solution that you've come up with.
Yeah, and just to be clear, you are correct in how they're evaluating and considering making it impervious. The big concern that we've seen in Virginia is actually during construction when the site is not stabilized. And you're correct in that because there's not a steady drip line, we haven't seen that erosion be an issue once vegetation establishes.
The impervious cover issue and what the state is considering, and if in fact they make these panels impervious, they would only be impervious. I withdraw my question, excuse me. I'm mistaken. Got it. I just answered my own question. Thank you.
To your point, Commissioner, I think there is differing views on the potential guidance, but we're looking to meet the guidance.
Any other questions for the applicant?
I'll just add this other one condition that's in there, and that's the tilling of the soil, and so that you're preserving that, which is another one of the stipulations that they put in there. So you really have tried to be a good citizen for us for the next 21 years to make sure that when that property finally comes back, it'll be usable.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioners.
I have so far one speaker card, Mr. Campbell.
Members of the commission, my name is Gary Campbell, and I represent the Campbell families residing at 230 and 234 Peach Street respectively. We have the property that adjoins the Chong's property, and our properties directly look over the prospective solar farm. Given today's climate towards the steady progress of clean renewable energy and the county's precedence of previous approvals of the solar projects in our area alone, I understand that the approval of the Pivot Energy solar project is highly likely. Our properties stand to be the most impacted of any of the land abutters for this project, since it impacts us on several fronts, from our view shed over the adjacent agricultural fields located to the rear of our property, to the use of the right-of-way located on the side of our property as a construction entrance, as well as the use of our existing driveway in the front leading to the project property from the Peach Street crossing. With that being said, Pivot Energy and their representative, Mr. Becker, has been in constant communication with us. He's been soliciting our feedback and concerns and taking action on mitigating the impact on our property. Their approach to being good neighbors has been appreciated, and we look forward to seeing that play out during the entirety of this project. Our most pressing concern with the county at this time is the directing of all the construction traffic of this project to use of the Peach Street rail crossing. Our preference as one of several residents of that crossing would be to limit the crossing during the construction phase to certain time periods, probably, and only to those larger equipment and delivery vehicles which could not safely use the natural property crossing at 7294 Richmond Road. While our preference would be to keep the status quo, we understand that change is inevitable, and we hope the county will be attentive to the concerns of the Peachtree residents and ensure that this project is completed on time and to the necessary specifications while mitigating the impact to our property and the residents of Peach Street should this project secure the proper approval. Thank you. Do you have any questions as far as, I know, Ms. Knoll, you were asking about the easement on that property that adjoins ours?
So, Mr. Campbell, this is a time for you to address the commission.
Okay,
It's not
sure.
Q&A, so
Sure.
thank you
All
very
right.
much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. So, is there anybody else that wishes to comment on this application? Seeing and hearing none, I will close the public hearing and open it up for discussion. Alderman?
I plan to support this application. I think it's a good one. The two conditions for AFD withdrawal that are in conflict, I guess, is the request is caused by changes of circumstances that could not have been anticipated at the time of application. And I think this is simply a matter of making a reasonable assumption on what conditions would be and to try to develop the project and then finding out just a month afterwards that the conditions have changed from the most recent. I think that meets that circumstance. And B, is this a public service? I think it clearly is. Not only in the definitions that Mr. Becker provided earlier, but this is part of a nationwide and local goal of decarbonizing power generation. We have one in addition to the GSAs that Mr. Becker mentioned, environmental 4, work with private sector and other governmental entities such as HRPDC and the state through both regulation and non-regulatory techniques to mitigate and adapt the effects of climate change. And here we are. The first strategy under that, 4.1, continue to implement reduction strategies by reducing building energy and transportation fuel consumption. So here we are. This, and then you add into that the discount for low-income people. That goes into workforce housing or of housing affordability, which is another goal of the county. This strikes me as a very good project, and so I plan to support it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the AFD withdrawal request, I agree with Mr. Haldeman's rationale. I came to the same conclusion that the two areas of contention, one had to do with the timing. Had it been, I think, common knowledge up front to the applicant during the open AFD withdrawal period, they would have, in addition to the 42 acres they'd have pulled the other 10. So I really do feel that they were caught with some changing definitions of impervious cover and some other things. So I think that requirement was met, and I do think that the current policy on AFD withdrawals, talking about a public facility, is too narrow of a view in today's day and age of climate issues and public needs and so on and so forth. And I do agree that this does serve as a public facility. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to support the SUP, but I do support the AFD withdrawal of the additional 10 acres for that reason. It would be nice if there was a way to guarantee that the applicant or the landowner who said that they would add some additional acreages to the AFD down the road if this was approved. It'd be nice to somehow guarantee that, and I don't know if legally there is, but other than to take it on a good faith effort. Moving to the application itself, there were two changes that I'd like to recommend to my colleagues as well as the applicant that have to do with the conditions. And I don't think there'll be a problem because they seem philosophically to be consistent with what the applicant said their philosophy was on the plantings. But one was condition number 5, the vegetated buffer. And I would just like to request that we add a sentence to item B saying the majority of evergreen shrubs and trees should be native species. And then condition number 6, native pollinators, I'd like to amend the statement slightly so it reads site ground cover that includes native pollinators and native grasses. And the whole idea, it seems like splitting hairs, but there is a difference between native pollinators and native grasses, and so I would just like to get that rolled in, so regardless of whether this application is recommended for approval or denial. I'd like these conditions, the amended conditions, to go to the Board of Supervisors with those changes, if everybody is in agreement. As to the application itself, I'm really torn because I'm very much a proponent of reducing dependence on fossil fuel sources, reducing carbon emissions. I mean, Virginia has been a member of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. We talked a lot about carbon sequestration in our comprehensive plan and goals and strategies to that end. And so, you know, I am a proponent of solar and other power. Some of the issues that I'm struggling with right now is this 105 acres, I think, policy. We're sort of nibbling away at the EO zone, the Hill Pleasant Economic Opportunity Zone. The Hill Pleasant Solar Farm went in for that significant acreage. This is now another 100 acres or so. And even though staff says this is a transitionary use from the current use to EO, these leases are for 20 years with an option to renew. And so to me, that seems like a little longer timeline than just transitionary. So I'm not quite sure, to be honest, how I'm going to vote on the SUP, but I am going to support the 10-acre withdrawal from a logic standpoint.
Mr. Crop? Mr. Bolster?
I'll make a motion, 3 motions if I can.
So can,
Oh, I'm sorry.
right, so I just wanted to see if there are any other comments before we entertained a motion. I will just say real quick that I struggle with this. You know, this was our first opportunity for economic opportunity going back a number of years ago. And because there was a designation on this parcel and a lot of hand-wringing and the like, you know, I did not support the other solar farm application, and for those same reasons I iterated before, I don't intend to support this one tonight. So for that, Mr. Polster, you.
Got 3 motions. The first
So
one.
we're going to do these, we have to do them individually because they'll
Okay.
be individual
The
roll
first
calls.
motion then is to approve the withdrawal of AFD 220017.
So we have a motion to withdraw. So, Mr. Holt?
Mr. Crop,
Aye.
Mr. Haldeman,
Aye.
Mr. Polster,
Aye.
Mr. Rose,
Aye.
Ms. Knoll,
No.
Mr. Rogers,
Aye.
and Mr. O'Connor.
No. Mr. Polster, your second?
The second motion is the Planning Commission approve SUP 220015 with the conditions and the recommended amended conditions that Mr. Kraft had.
Can I interrupt real quick? Just, we didn't ask the applicant, we tend to. So should we ask them if they're willing to amend the conditions?
Got a thumbs up.
So, okay, so. No, that would be helpful. I just don't want to put something out there that you guys say no. So, so we have a motion to approve with the
Current
amended
conditions and the
conditions
amended
per
ones by Mr.
Mr. Crop. So,
And those are, as read into the, specifically reference that the plantings be native.
right.
Okay. Mr. Crop,
Aye.
Mr. Haldeman,
Aye.
Mr. Polster,
Aye.
Mr. Rose,
Aye.
Ms. Knoll,
No.
Mr. Rogers,
Aye.
and Mr. O'Connor.
No.
Thank you. Motion carries.
And the final recommendation is that the Planning Commission find the SUP to be consistent with the comprehensive plan.
Mr. Crow?
Aye.
Mr. Haldeman?
Aye.
Mr. Polster?
Aye.
Mr. Rose?
Aye.
Ms. Knoll?
No.
Mr. Rogers?
Aye.
And Mr. O'Connor?
No.
Thank you. Motion carries.
Thank you very much. Our next case this evening, SUP-20-0010, Hertzler Clearing and Grading. Mr. Crump, good evening.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman and members of the commission. Ms. Mary Hertzler has applied for a special use permit to allow for the operation of a contractor's office, warehouse, and manufacturing of wood products at 9537 Barnes Road. The property is zoned A1 General Agricultural, is designated rural lands on the comprehensive plan land use map, and is located outside the primary service area. The business is currently operating on the property, and this application has been submitted to bring the use into conformance with the zoning ordinance. In 2019, the zoning division met with the property owner after receiving a complaint regarding the operation of the business. Staff discussed the activities and violations occurring and that a special use permit would be needed to bring the use into conformance. The applicant states that the business has been operating from the property for approximately 20 years. In the year 2000, a special use permit was submitted for the operation of a contractor's office, warehouse, storage, and repair of heavy equipment, and the manufacture and sale of wood products. The application was considered by the Planning Commission and recommended for approval. It was then considered by the Board of Supervisors, where it was ultimately denied. Since this time, the area utilized for the business operation has increased without the appropriate approvals or permitting from the county. Impacts to the resource protection area include land disturbance and clearing of trees, and the construction of a pond, and the construction of a driveway onto neighboring property. The construction of the pond and driveway have also impacted existing wetlands. These existing site conditions are shown on the master plan. County staff has reviewed the application to address the impacts of the business. The Stormwater and Resource Protection Division has reviewed the application regarding stormwater management design for the current business operation. The proposed SUP conditions would require impacts to the resource protection area and wetlands to be remediated, proof of appropriate permits for impacts to the wetlands, and that stormwater management design be sufficient raw development on the property. Additional proposed conditions included, but are not limited to, restricting the hours of operation of certain business activities from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. to reduce potential noise impacts, prohibiting sales on the property, prohibiting signage associated with the business, restricting vehicular access to the business to only come from Barnes Road, providing buffering and screening for the business from Barnes Road and adjoining properties, various fire safety measures, limiting the height of light poles and prohibiting any light trespass onto adjoining properties. If the SUP were to be approved, the site plan would be required for the business. It would need to show all existing improvements being brought into full conformance with the master plan, SUP conditions, zoning ordinance, and other applicable regulations. The proposed conditions would require that the site plan be submitted within 12 months of the date of the approval of the SUP and receive final site approval within 24 months of the date of approval of the SUP. The proposed conditions would also require that the county staff inspect the property within 6 months of the date of the approval of the SUP to verify existing site conditions, and within 36 months of the date of approval of the SUP to verify that all improvements shown on the site plan are completed and that the site is in full compliance with the SUP and site plan. Staff finds this proposal is compatible with surrounding zoning and development and consistent with the 2045 comprehensive plan, and recommends that Planning Commission recommend approval of this application subject to the proposed conditions. At this time, I'd be happy to answer any questions you have, and the representatives for the applicant are also available. Thank you.
Mr. Crump, any questions? Ms. Knoll?
Yes. Mr. Croft, can you, see. So you're saying that a pond was put on there without permission, right? Correct. That they were denied an application in 2000, right? And they've been operating 22 years without any permits.
Correct.
Is that correct? Okay. And were there any neighborhood complaints during that time?
Yes, from 2001, staff has recorded complaints received in 2002, 2004, and 2011. And then in 2019, received the latest complaint. So
And the
four.
letter we received this week?
Yes,
Yes, okay. And so the stormwater, the pond has been put in and it has no permits, right? Citizen complains, a driveway added with no permits, correct?
correct.
Neighborhood complaints, it was denied, it was violated in 2020, right? As being, operating illegally.
In 2019, staff received a complaint and met with the property owner to
Right.
discuss remediation.
Okay,
And they submitted the SUP for this current SUP in 2020.
okay. So they've been in business for 22 years with no permits at all.
Correct.
What would happen to this facility if the Board of Supervisors denies this SUP?
So if the board denies the SUP, in short, the property would need to be brought into compliance with all applicable regulations set forth in the zoning ordinance and Chesapeake Bay ordinance. This includes ceasing all business activities, removing all business equipment, vehicles, materials, debris, logs, stumps, wet pond, road crossing, and provide RPA mitigation. County staff will work with the county attorney's office to achieve compliance.
Business activity on this site would cease.
Correct.
Mr. Crump?
Good evening, Mr. Crump. Just a quick question. I was looking for the condition that stipulated staff being allowed to enter the property to inspect, and I thought there were two specific time windows that were laid out in that condition. And that's what I was trying to find out what they were. And my question was, can that be broadened a bit to say, I'd hate that condition to limit staff to those two calendar windows, and then if there's another complaint registered in between that time or after those times, that the applicant would refuse staff access to the property to investigate, which I think had been done previously, refused to let staff enter it. So this is a roundabout way of asking, if this condition is approved, would staff be able to visit the property in response to complaints over and above the time zones, timeframes laid out in the existing draft?
Mr. Croft, I'll actually take that one on. I wouldn't recommend that one at this time. I think the way the conditions are proposed, we've proposed one that would allow for those site visits at the beginning to verify the current conditions, and then one at the end to verify that all of the improvements have been brought up and become consistent with both the master plan and site plan, assuming that this moves forward. I think post-completion of the site plan and post-completion of a final inspection to do just that, to verify that the improvements are consistent with the master plan and any approved final site plans, really at that point, it would fall into the category, much like any other property in the county, where if we were to get a complaint in the future, we would work through, again, in responding to a complaint, we would first look to work with the applicant, and usually that resolves most everything, and is a practice that traditionally works pretty well. In those very few instances where that doesn't work, we then can work with the county attorney's office to see what other options are available. And so far, those have been pretty tried and true, and we've used with some pretty good success. And so, at least for staff, our recommendation would be for sort of post-site plan, we would go with the existing practices and would not at this point feel like we would need to add in some additional points in the SUP conditions at this time.
Okay, good. If you're comfortable with them, I am as well. Thank you.
So I'm sorry if I could just tag on to that. From the photos, it appears that the mulch pile or the soil pile is probably 30 to 40 feet high, and I know that we have a limitation in here on the cubic yards, but isn't the expectation, and I didn't think about this before, so I apologize, but isn't the expectation that it would have a silt fence around it?
Not for, you're saying for mulch or for soil?
Well, it appears to be mixed because they have part of the applicant's narrative and from the view of it, it appears that it's a combination of soil and mulch, and they screen the soil to sell topsoil.
Certainly some of those details would come into play as we look at the site plan and what the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Ordinance. I mean, if it's a material and active process, then no. And I think as an example, if for anyone who say visited Markley Road, there isn't necessarily silt fence around those stockpiles. At least in that instance, those are being used for retail. This isn't a retail process, but if it's in an active process, then traditionally, no, you wouldn't need to do that. That would be built into the site plan as part of the larger stormwater requirements to bring the site into compliance. Usually the stockpiles that have the silt fence or have E&S ones are ones that are done during active construction or actual stockpiles that aren't used in process, but that may be sitting for several months. Those need to be stabilized for sure. But if it's in an active, sort of in use in process, then no. It turns into permanent grading or permanent storage, then that's a different category for sure.
Well, I mean, to me, it just appeared that the activity was right next to the pond. So, I would expect that there would be some sort of, because the narrative says that the soil is screened, I think up to 6 hours every single week. So obviously it's active, and it's not covered. I was just curious if there's a way to create a condition that says there will be inspections by a third party to report back to the county that there is active E&S and it's in good shape. So,
Well, again, should this SUP be approved and should this application move into the site plan stage, part of accounting for that runoff, part of accounting for that storage, part of accounting for that continuous moving of dirt will be factored into the total plan. It'll be factored into any remediation plans that get done. And again, with the idea, if this gets approved, that a lot of these features on site that have not had the benefit of that engineering level design would be then brought into compliance.
sorry to hijack. So, Dr. Rose?
Yeah, you had mentioned that a driveway was constructed on a neighboring property. Who owns the neighboring property?
I believe the applicant owns the neighboring property.
They put it on their own property. They didn't put it on somebody else's property.
They put it on a property that they happen to own.
Okay, that's fine. And I think that my question could be answered by either of you. So this business wasn't approved in 2000. It's been running illegally for 20 plus years, even with complaints. Does if it gets approved now, does that actually give the county, and we're being asked to approve it with conditions, which they've been legal business for 20 years, we can wonder if the conditions will be respected. Does approving it give the county more ability to go in and check on those conditions and confirm those conditions are being held to? Or
Well, as Mr. Croft alluded to, we have some conditions where we would do an inspection before the site plan. So after the SUP was approved, we'd go in there just to see what's out there because we haven't had an opportunity to do that yet. And then we would, work with the applicant of what would need to be, remedied, mitigated. And then they would submit the site plan, which would further the mitigation and requirements that they need to comply with. And then once the site plan would be approved, we'd go back out there to make sure that everything's being built, into compliance. And then, after that, if there's any issues or problems, we could go back and say, well, as part of your site plan, you said you were going to do this. As part of your SUP, you said you were going to mitigate this and do this. So, so I think what we have is sufficient for the long road.
Mr. Rose, and again, maybe more a literal interpretation of your point. So with an SUP or really any of these conditions, it does not convey some other extraordinary ability for staff to access private property. That will always stay the same. However, should we get complaints on noise or on any other aspect of the operation, certainly with the conditions, it is easier for us to objectively discern whether or not the ongoing operation is in conflict with those. And so, again, we would still have to go through the normal processes, either voluntarily or, through a different way through the county attorney's office to get access to verify those conditions. But
So I guess the follow-up is, if it's not approved, they could continue to run the business illegally, and even with complaints, it could go another 20 years without anything happening.
no, so again, as Mr. Crump mentioned earlier, if this application is not approved, those improvements would need to be removed, and the property, all of those improvements, all of those conditions would need to be abated. And so that's actually what happened following the previous denial. Staff was able to abate, and then at some point it started up again. But, again, none of that would change in this instance. If it was not approved, those improvements would have to be removed and the environmental impacts remediated.
Rogers?
I'm struggling with the 25 megabyte historical data on it. Could you summarize, if it's possible, what happened in, I think it's 2000, when the staff recommends approval for basically the same business, goes to the Board of Supervisors who does not approve it. And I can't find, is any of their rationale available as to what they found a reason not to approve it?
Looking at the minutes, the historical minutes, there was, I think, a lot of public comment and people who spoke out against the application. And the minutes don't really go into detail the rationale of the board, but yeah, it was denied 5-0 by the board.
And it's more action-oriented minutes than really sort of a more robust narrative of the meeting. So
Right, so that's how I
some of
read
that
it.
context is not in there.
It's just very striking to me, though, that as far as I can tell, it's the same business. It's the same basic proposal, moving in the same direction as before, and a 5-0 vote seems very decisive. I also just wonder, more an elephant in the room, probably no one in here maybe can answer it, but if people know there are properties that aren't in compliance, why as a county do we allow it to go for 2 decades?
As our long-standing practice, even going back before 2000, we respond on a complaint basis.
Mr. Holt, there've been complaints over the years and nobody has gone out there.
So we do have a record of a couple early on, and they're, so let me back up. We have received complaints in the past. Remember that, without some ability to access the property, our typical inspection process, our typical validation process, our typical ability to see what's going on, legally we are limited to what can be observed from the public right-of-way. And so, as you can see, there's lots of forested conditions on this site. It's not as, always as obvious, probably driving down Barnes Road or say even I-64 as to some of those day-to-day operations. And so while we have received some complaints over time, you know, I don't have any other new information to share with you tonight other than my assumption would be they were investigated, and with at least at what was going on at the time, there was either nothing found, but more than likely there may not have been enough that was observed to take it to the next level. Or at least that was a decision at that point. It's hard for me to sort of really know or second guess that. But like I say, at least in terms of the current history and what got us to tonight, stemmed from that 2019 complaint.
Okay. My concern is that you allow this to happen tonight. What we're saying to everybody else in the county who wants to start a restaurant, do anything else, start a business, and we turn them down, and we're just going to let them do it. And that's not right. There are rules, you know, it's poor behavior, you know, when you don't follow the rules. And so I can't support it at all.
Let's do the public hearing before we get into discussion. Dr. Rose, did you have more questions? Mr. Alderman?
Just, Mr. Rogers already touched on this, I think, but this is substantially the same application that was submitted in 2000, is it not?
Yes, I believe so.
It looked like it.
Yeah, just based on the.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions, Mr. Crump? Or Mr. Holt? So, thank you, Mr. Crump. Appreciate it. This time, I'd like to go ahead and open up the public hearing for this. Mr. Getty?
Mr. Chairman, can I make a disclosure? I had a conversation with Mr. Getty on the phone the other day, just in general about this application.
As did I.
As did I.
Three. Others? Thank you very much. Mr. Getty, good evening.
Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, I'm Vernon Getty. I'm here representing Stephen and Mary Hertzler, the owners of Hertzler Clearing and Grading and the owners of this parcel. Of course, the parcel, as you know, is 28.6 acres. It's zoned A1. It's rural lands on the county comprehensive plan. It's bounded by Interstate 64 along this long side of the property. Across Barnes Road is the Hazelwood property, which is economic opportunity and zoned for major commercial development. The property outlined in red here is property owned by the Hertzler family. So I think where a driveway might have been is between parcels under the same ownership. And there are scattered residences between here and Old Stage Road, Route 30. The history of the property and this business, it was acquired by the Hertzlers in 1998. As you know, they applied for a special use permit in 2000 and it was denied. Subsequent to that, in conversations with, I'm not sure who, but somebody who was affiliated with the county, indicated to the Hertzlers that in fact a special use permit shouldn't have been required for their use, that it was permitted in an agricultural zone. I think they in good faith believed that and began operations. This is an aerial photo from 2002, and you can see just the very beginnings of development on the site. They have operated continuously from the site since then. They actually live on the site. Flip back to this area. This is the Hertzler's home back here on this portion of the site. And over the ensuing years, it was just incrementally developed as the business operation has grown. Business is a small family-owned business. It's in the land clearing and rough grading business. They have from 8 to 10 employees, 4 of whom are family members, and not all the employees come to the site every day. Some go directly to job sites. In the impact statement we submitted, we listed and showed you pictures of all the equipment they own. think it's a great business in that their goal is to reuse and recycle all the wood and soil materials from their land clearing operation. It's an environmentally responsible way to deal with this rather than just dumping it in a landfill. So I think it's a good business. They have contractors' offices, they have vehicle and equipment storage and maintenance, and a picture of that. This is the yard where materials are dumped and sorted. They'll truck in the materials from their clearing jobs, and they're sorted, then processed either through grinding or sawing or screening for topsoil. This is their mulch grinder. Every 3 to 4 weeks, stumps and brush are ground into mulch. Generally no more than 400 to 500 cubic yards of mulch are on site at any given time. In with this clearing debris, a good bit of soil comes in, so that's screened using a topsoil screener. And once a week, they bring a load of manure from Dreamcatcher's stables over and mix it in with the soil to improve its organic content and to help Dreamcatchers out with their disposal problem. Logs, appropriate sized logs, are cut into timber, which is dried on site, and that takes place 3 or 4 days a week. And then 1 day a week, that lumber is typically used and is assembled into pallets. The site is not open to the public. There are no retail sales of any product from the site. All the materials are trucked by the Hertzlers to the customers or end users. The applicant has indicated there's an average of 20 total trips in and out of the site per day. It's a level that doesn't trigger any requirements for a traffic study. And the vast majority of the traffic is traveling the segment of Barnes Road between the site and Route 30. All the site traffic uses a single entrance to the property off Barnes Road, which if this is approved will be upgraded to meet a VDOT commercial entrance standard. VDOT has reviewed this application and raised no traffic concerns. Applicant indicates its vehicles have never been involved in an accident on Barnes Road. So we agree with staff's recommendation and approval. This proposal is consistent with the 2045 comprehensive plan. It's compatible with surrounding zoning and development. They agree with the proposed SUP conditions, and in fact, some work has already started. The wetlands on the site have been delineated. The Corps of Engineers has been on site and approved the delineation and indicated the Corps has no issues with the site. It does bring this, it would be the first step to bringing this site into compliance with applicable county ordinances and requirements. And approval of this would allow a small family-owned business to continue to operate. And again, I think the Hertzlers in good faith believe they were permitted to operate, and I think the fact they operated for 20 years with the county knowing they were there and operating sort of reinforced that belief. So this is an opportunity to bring it in compliance and to allow them to continue the business. So we would ask you to recommend approval to the board, and I'd be glad to try to answer any questions. And Chase Grogg with Land Tech is here, who did the master plan you've seen. And
Thank you, Mr. Getty. Any questions for Mr. Getty? Thinking.
Well, I was just going to make the comment that, and I was going to ask our Land Tech representative, is that your draft master plan, it looks like you've already taken a decisive step in terms of the terrain itself, the topography, and not only the wetland delineation, but one of the things I noticed is the contours on this, and then of course the location of what the current BMP is for it. Have the Hertzlers been made aware of this type of work, or did they pay for it?
Yep, yeah, so we were, as soon as they were notified of this issue, they contracted with us to begin We did an entire topographic survey and boundary survey of the property, as well as they contracted with Matt Roth with Roth Environmental to get the wetlands delineated and confirmed by the Army Corps. Again, the Corps has been out there and has listed no violations with the current wetland situation on the site. You can see from our master plan, there are a couple minor encroachments into the RPA, but the pond that you discussed, yes, is a non-RPA feature, and in the site plan process, if approved, would be actually upgraded to what's called a level 2 wet pond. So it would be, to your point, yes, that's where the water's already kind of going, and that's why we did the topography to get an idea for what would need to happen at the site plan phase to make sure we can make work what they have.
I'm pretty sure about this, but I wanted to verify with you, is the county takes a look at all of its 900 BMPs within the county every 5 years. And so I would assume that this BMP would fall underneath that. And in fact, the county would have an opportunity to go in and take a look at what the conditions are with the BMP, especially with the topography and where the piles are going to be.
Correct, yeah, and it would have a maintenance plan, which is what the county would be looking to inspect.
When I remember the other Hertzler property off of Richmond Road that we did and the bins of stuff, there was actually a storage requirement. Will any of these facilities for the mulch or anything like that require some special facilities? A concrete basin with siding?
Yeah, I mean, since the site's pretty fluid, they kind of have their piles while they're sorting. I don't know, it's definitely something we could look at. It's not something we've gotten to at this process, but I think it would definitely help, be one of the ways to maintain with the silt fence to be able to control that. Those concrete barriers are great for being able to control that and have specific areas. The issue with silt fences, it's just not meant to be, it's not meant to be there for 5 years, so concrete's not going anywhere. So yes, could definitely be utilized to help stabilize that area, again, with that pond right there also.
Thank you.
I just want to clarify that Hertzler application was separate. It's not the same.
I understand, but it's the same conditions and storage.
Right.
And it's the same sort of stormwater things that they had to face, which is why I brought it up.
No, understood. I just clarifying for everybody that they
Okay,
were
good,
separate
yes.
applications here, so, and separate groups, so.
Just practically, one of the distinctions, to the degree that some of those concrete barriers are used to either divert or direct the direction of stormwater, functionally, they can certainly be used for that. To me, this is almost a little bit of a different operation. I think certainly those concrete barriers are very critical where you might be having, say, a final product that you need to keep preserved. I think that particular application, that was for a landscape contractor, so they really needed to make sure the stuff didn't get mixed together and grades of mulch.
What I was thinking of specifically is they sort the soil and then they bring in manure. And that manure mixed in with the soil has a way to leach out. And when you go out to dream catchers, you'll see that they store their manure in concrete bunkers. And I would assume that those sort of things would probably take place with the soil and the topsoil piece. Maybe not with the other mulching piece, that I understand.
Any other questions?
Thank you.
Gentlemen, appreciate it. The speaker card I have tonight is Joshua Mapes. Evening, Mr. Mapes.
Oh, well, sir. Joshua Mays, 135 Racefield Drive. I actually am in a weird position where I can speak to the 2,000 votes on this. My mother was one of the individuals who spoke out loudly against this, along with just about every resident of Racefield Drive on the property. I could see my house on that property there. This is something that residents of that neighborhood have been living with for 2.5 decades. I remember learning how to drive, getting my car driven off the road by tractor trailers pulling into the Hertzler property. I remember sitting in school buses where the school bus was pulled off the road because tractor trailers were coming through at 6 in the morning, 6:30 in the morning. This has been something that from the time of the 2000 Board of Supervisors, when I remember it was, to date this was Supervisor Jim Kennedy, back when he was running against Andy Bradshaw way back when, that this was a well-known and incredibly publicized backlash. Nobody in the neighborhood supported it. Nobody wanted it. It was very well known that it was something that had no public support. From almost the minute it was denied, there were clear aspects of they were going around the back of the county and doing it anyway. I think it might have been less than 6 months before we saw dump trucks regularly moving in and out of the property. I remember, I would challenge the dates of some of the some of the complaints, because my mother complained every year that she was there. She moved out last year. This was a nonstop. I cannot remember driving down Barnes Road without seeing trucks moving in and out within, I'm sorry, this one's got me a little bit emotional just because it's something that my parents fought when I was in middle school. I watched them thinking that they had won this fight, and that now to see it come back and to see that they literally, the county told them, no, don't do this. And there was no mitigation. I can promise you that there was no mitigation or attempt at mitigation. Within days, they were continuing to operate their business just outside of county approval. They've never slowed down. You can drive down Barnes Road and see the number of ditches on both sides of the road where cars have been forced to swerve out of the way, because there was a while where that road was at 50 miles an hour, then they moved it to 45 miles an hour, then they moved it to 40 miles an hour. None of which has had an impact, because those trucks come through at all hours of the day and are at absolute top speed. I've seen logging trucks moving through in a convoy coming off of 30 onto Barnes, 6 or 7 trucks in a row, all pulling directly into the neighborhood. And when I would call, I'd be, oh, there's nothing you can do. I cannot urge strongly enough members of the Planning Commission to vote this down, to actually enforce the return of this to the condition it was in before the Hertzlers ignored the county, before they ignored any bit of reasonable accommodation. They never took it back to the board afterwards. They never said, oh, hey, we hear this, need it. The arguments that were taking place at the Planning Commission and before the Board of Supervisors should have made it clear that there was a vested county interest in this. The fact that they then began to act as if there wasn't is beyond the pale. I'm sorry, I'm gonna end my comments there, but I cannot request strongly enough, please find an opposition to this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mace. Anybody else wish to speak on this application? Seeing and hearing none, I'm going to close the public hearing and open it up for discussion. If you all don't mind, I do have one question for staff. If I remember correctly, just in reading all of this, a big concern obviously was traffic, and certainly that was Mr. May's piece. With the Hazelwood property, if and when that is developed, do I remember correctly that we would see improvements on Barnes Road to access that property?
That one in particular has a condition that says there shall not be any permanent driveway connection onto Barnes. That there's an allowance for an emergency ingress and egress for emergency purposes only, but no.
Maybe that's what I was thinking. All right, thank you. Appreciate that. Mr. Alderman?
This question just occurred to me. I don't know why it took so long, but if the county had not known that this business was operating, how did that play into the real estate tax assessment? If the county just assumed that this was open space A1 rural lands, it would be assessed at one value. And if there's an ongoing business, I assume that would increase the real estate value. I wonder, has the applicant been paying lower taxes than real estate taxes than otherwise?
Certainly follow up with Director of Real Estate. Back over this.
I should have asked that last week. I didn't think of it.
Holster?
I was going to add, I think what you may be thinking about is sort of the traffic impact analysis that was done for the Hazelwood and then the property above there, that it would probably result in a traffic light at the Barnes Road. You may be thinking about that.
Yeah, that I knew. I just thought there
Yeah,
was.
But
there would
the
be-
exit, there was a turnaround at that one corner, but it did not go into Barnes Road.
Just a question for Mr. Crump also, and going back to the 2000 SUP application, just to still try to clarify this, was it a case where there was a limited existing business that was either beginning operation and the SUP was for an expanded version of that? Or was the SUP denial, did that mean nothing should, of what is currently there should be on that site?
Verify that. I believe it's the latter.
It's the latter that nothing.
I believe so. Give us a quick second. We'll triple check that for
Yeah,
you.
I was looking at the 2000 staff report minutes here.
And while you're doing that, since I do have the floor for the time being, can I also propose another amendment to the conditions, regardless of whether this is recommended for approval or denial here, has to do with condition number 9A, and just have it read, and I'll read this verbatim so it can be incorporated in the record. Existing vegetation in the buffer areas shall be retained and supplemented as necessary with additional plantings, a majority of which shall be native species to meet the requirements of section 24-96 of the county code. And so if nobody objects to that, including the applicant, I'd like to put that in.
Give a thumbs up.
Yeah, it appears this was also a use that was occurring and they were applying to get a special use permit as
Okay,
well.
so there was some usage going
activity.
on that property, and all uses were denied.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. This is a
Any more questions for Mr. Crump? Are we? Thank you. All right, go ahead, Mr. Crump.
No, I was just going to say that this is, I don't like the way this evolved. I think were it not for probably the threat of additional legal action, we would not have seen this SUP, and that bothers me. But I also feel that our role is not an enforcement role. Our role is to interpret a land use application against the ordinances and the comp plan. And if these conditions are all implemented, then this business will be in compliance. And so regardless of how poorly handled this process was for 20 years and the lack of the applicants willing to work with, apparently work with the county on bringing this into compliance, this SUP would make this a legally conforming business operation. And we've had other cases, before the Planning Commission, like Johnny Timbers and Tiki and a number of others where businesses were being operated inappropriately on sites, and we've dealt with that. And in a sense, this is a larger scale, but is no different than some of those those other applications. It just leaves a bad taste in my mouth as to how we got to this point. And that's all I'll say on the matter.
Dr. Rose?
I maybe have I agree with everything you've said, but I also act on here from 2000 from asking from the that take everything we've heard tonight at face value, both from the applicants and the community members that came out, as well as letters. The impact happened anyway, even with the county saying we neighborhood, and they haven't done anything to mitigate that impact. And with the complaints, presumably the Hertzler's heard some of the complaints as well. And so for me, I have to consider that impact. And I think that impact exists, whether it comes up to code or not, that impact is still going to exist.
Holster?
I can't do anything about what happened 22 years ago. But I think in good faith, the applicant has come forward to try to make it right. And they've taken steps to put money on the table to be able to do some of the preliminary engineering work, the impact statements, and therefore are really trying to get in conformance, which is, after all, what we would like to see as a land use piece. Now, to the issue of the impact on additional neighbors, what's remarkable is about that one slide that Mr. Getty showed is a lot of surrounding property belongs to the Hertzlers. I'm sure that they act as a buffer to any of that other area around there. But having said that, it's a business. It makes money for the county. I would like to see Jack's, whether or not there's a BPAL tax they're being paid. So the county at least may have been getting its share of it. But the notion is that they're trying to conform, and we need to give them a chance to do that, as opposed to saying, no, we don't want this business. So anyhow, I intend to support it.
I'll just say one more thing. I know a bunch of the complaints were about noise and chipping going on in the middle of the night, and at 6 in the morning, like Mr. Mays said, all the noise. They say they'll operate 8 to 5, but who's there to watch?
Doesn't that come back to, if there's a violation of the SUP, now the county has something to do about it? But I mean, it runs on a complaint piece for it. So, you know, if we don't like the conditions that we're talking about, then what other conditions would you like to make sure that they're in compliance?
I mean, I personally struggle with this a bit, simply because it appears that, you know, a vote to approve would be rewarding bad behavior, you know. But as Mr. Kropp said, you know, we're neither a punitive or an enforcement body. You know, our job is to take the application that's in front of us and work from that framework. You know, unfortunately, it looks like this was a case of bad enforcement or non-enforcement, and that doesn't fall to the purview of those of us sitting up here. You know, I will beat my drum to a slightly different piece. Is, you know, here's a rural land. You know, our comp plan talks about, you know, creating, you know, preserving agricultural and forestal economy, you know, and this does that to a great extent. You know, I recognize the challenges with the trucks, and we certainly have seen that in other pieces. And as Mr. Kropp said, we've had several applications come through the past few years. Jolly Pond Road, on the other side of 64, where we had operations for timbering that were not in compliance, and ultimately they came into compliance and approved, you know, with those approvals. And I really think this is a case of, what do we get out on the other side? Meaning, do we get a compliant site that is good for both the wetlands, for the economy, and a different use for rural lands that don't involve solar farms or 1 to 28. This would have one house on it. It does have one house on it. So again, it's a bit of a struggle for me because it does seem like we're rewarding bad behavior. But I look at it at this point that's really not our job. If the Board of Supervisors elects to go in a different direction, they have the bigger sandbox to play in than we do. And strictly from a land use, to me, there's not a reason to deny this application. Mr. Polster?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion that the Planning Commission approve SUP 20-00110 with the amendment that Mr. Kraft had to 9A for the plantings to be pollinators and natural woods.
Mr. Holt, we have a motion.
Motions to approve with the amended conditions. Mr. Crop.
Aye.
Mr. Haldeman.
No.
Mr. Polster.
Aye.
Mr. Rose.
No.
Ms. Knoll.
No.
Mr. Rogers.
No.
And Mr. O'Connor.
Aye.
The motion did not carry, and this vote will be forwarded on to the board that a motion to recommend approval did not pass by a vote of 4 to 3.
Thank you very much. Our final application tonight, SUP-22-0019, 4090 Ironbound Road, Detached Accessory Dwelling. Ms. Condon, good evening.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the Planning Commission. Mr. Hua Hin
Excuse
has
me,
a-
can you pick up?
Oh, yeah, of course.
Speak
Is that
louder, I
better?
can't hear you.
Sorry. Mr. Hua Hin has applied to our detached accessory apartment at 4090 Ironbound Road to convert part of an existing detached garage into a detached accessory apartment. This property is zoned R2 General Residential and is designated Low Density Residential on the 2045 Comprehensive Plan Land Use Map. The single-family dwelling on the property is currently occupied by the applicant, and building permits have been submitted for this proposal and are under review. The structure is 896 square feet, and the proposed apartment will be 394 square feet of the total structure. The remaining portion of the structure will continue to be used as a garage. The R2 General Residential Zoning District allows detached accessory apartments as a specially permitted use in accordance with Section 24-32B of the James City County Code. Staff has reviewed the proposed design and finds that all requirements have been met. Staff also finds that this proposal to be compatible with surrounding development and consistent with the 2045 Comprehensive Plan. Staff recommends that the Planning Commission recommend approval of this application to the Board of Supervisors, subject to the proposed conditions. I am happy to answer any questions that you may have, and a representative of the applicant is available as well. Thank you.
Any questions for Ms. Condon? Got off easy. Thanks.
Should have had her on first.
She should have come first.
At this time, I'd like to open the public hearing, and if the applicant's here, if you have any questions for the applicant, or if you wish to speak, feel free. So.
My name is Noel Miller. I represent my brother Hoa Hun, and thank you very much for the board to considering. And because my father, he immigrant and he cannot speak English, and he in the bed rest, so that's the reason we convert the apartment so we can be able to bring him home, and we take turn to take care of him without disturb his family life. So I really appreciate, if you support that. And thank you very much. If you have any question, if I can answer, I would like to answer.
Any questions? Oh, we're good. Thank you very much. So, anybody else wish to speak? Hearing and seeing none, I will close the public hearing and open it up.
Chairman, I move that we recommend approval for SUP-22-0019, 4090 Ironbound Road, detached accessory dwelling with conditions.
Mr. Haldeman, Mr. Holt, we have a motion to approve.
Mr. Crop.
Aye.
Mr. Haldeman.
Aye.
Mr. Polster.
Aye.
Mr. Rose.
Aye.
Ms. Knoll.
Aye.
Mr. Rogers.
Aye.
And Mr. O'Connor.
Aye.
Thank you. Motion carries.
Thank you very much. No planning commission considerations tonight, and that gives us the planning director's report. Mr. Holt?
Very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, nothing additional to add tonight, other than what's been included in the report. Be happy to take any questions.
Any questions for Mr. Holt? Dr. Rose?
Want to raise one issue. It goes back to something we approved, the Frothy Moon Brewery, over the summer. There was some concern about the parking, and this is just from people that I know use that boat launch, that boat parking is, I don't know if.
Across the street.
Across the street.
Or Jamestown Road.
The
Yeah.
parking is a horrible mess.
Yeah, the parking's a horrible mess. I know they have permission to park in the neighbor's lot, but it is a concern from the people who want to use that boat. Obviously not so much in the winter, but that's a very popular boat launch. I don't know if anything can or should be done about it, but it is, I know it was raised as a concern then, and it is coming.
Also, just even before you answer though, besides the boat launch, the lighting is terrible there. So right now, that's my way home every night. There's people running between the Frothy Moon across, they're all wearing black. They're all imperceptible, and there are cars on the shoulder of Jamestown Road on both sides. They're not just in the boat launch, they're spilling.
I mean, it's great that they're that successful and popular, but it could be a potential issue.
So certainly, as you mentioned, as part of the site plan approval process, there was an approved shared parking plan with the business immediately next door. I think we had at least conceived theoretically it may be possible for some overflow parking during the SUP phase. It does turn out that some of that may be happening, to your point. I do know just from conversations at the staff level, Parks and Recreation is aware of that, and they're actively monitoring that and doing the best they can and working with the owner to try to come up with a better solution. I do know some of the parking right in the grassed area right off of the roadway was a problem earlier on. Obviously, when they were nearing completion of construction earlier on this summer, it was still way too hot to plant landscaping. All of that area, all that grassed area up front is slated for landscaping with trees and shrubs, and so having some of that planted here probably soon as we're heading into the prime planting season, I think will help with that. But from those very early on casual parkers that sort of parked wherever, I have heard the owner jumped on that quick. So hopefully at least within that grassed area or within the right-of-way, that shouldn't be happening anymore.
Mr. Polster, can't go every day. Just one quick question. I know VDOT had some listening sessions, for lack of a better word, for 199 in Jamestown Road. Do you, anything out of that that's worthwhile to report?
Nothing to report. So certainly the time that has followed those, and probably at least for the next few months, if not all of October, is distilling all of those comments down. So they do have as part of their work plan to come back with a report, and that would summarize that public input and also make sort of a further set of recommendations and or refinements based on all of that public input is a next step. And so don't have any of that to report out. Still a little bit too soon. Got a lot of good input for sure. And so they're back at it and hope to hear something on that maybe, as we get closer to Thanksgiving.
So, thank you. Alderman?
I attended one of those meetings, the traffic projections on Route 199 for the next 20 years, or really, really ugly. The westbound evening rush hour projection approaching Brookwood is projected to back up to Colonial Parkway. It's 1.5 miles. If nothing is done, you can't widen it. It's another indictment of the really, really poor land use planning that this county has done over the last 50 years. And Williamsburg, both James City County, and I'm sorry out there, but, you know, Williamsburg has just opened up another 86 acres at Quarter Path for multifamily housing. And they approved a couple years ago 38 townhomes at the Brookwood Jamestown intersection. It's nuts. New Kent County is now the second fastest growing county in Virginia, next to Loudoun County, which is not a nice comparison. A lot of that traffic will feed into James City County. I'm not going to be here to see it, but good luck to you all.
Any other questions for Mr. Holt?
Is a procedural question, or should I do that after adjourning? Because I was kind of struggling with my materials. This isn't anything about how people voted, but on this Hertzler application, is there something in the materials, as I've seen in others, where they went out to all the residences and gave them a chance to comment? Like, I felt like that was missing in this new one.
We only got the one written correspondence. I mean, we followed the same procedures here as we do everywhere else, and, you know, this one was
Can you just
posted in-
reacquaint me with that, though? But so was there a notice sent to all the residents? I realize the Hertzlers own a lot of property, but
The immediately adjoining is the state code requirement. For convenience, we post a red sign by the site, and then, of course, you know, it gets posted to the agenda page and everything else, so. And, of course, you know, public hearing ads in the paper.
I drove out to Barnes Road the other day, and the sign's there, so it's very obvious to those driving by, so, if they're going slow enough, so. Any other questions for Mr. Holt? So, last thing on our agenda tonight is Planning Commission discussion and requests. Mr. Polster?
You've heard me say this a number of times, that we've been kind of going through an iterative process with the solar farms in terms of the conditions, as well as at one point during the comp plan, I was advocating a comprehensive plan. But I think that the process that we've been taking in terms of an iterative process to take a look at this is quite obvious in this last application, where they actually went to work with the Racefield folks, and they have done their homework and added a couple of new things, some of it by the state, or the anticipation of the change in the state code, but also some of it with just being a good neighbor. One of the things that I think is still missing, that I'd like the staff to consider, and it's not, I don't necessarily think that you need an ordinance or you need a condition, because it may be part of the staff process when we go through site plan review at the staff level, which is true for the finalization of the BMP pieces and what gets approved and all the rest of that. So the piece that I'd like to see us add to this thing is the maintenance piece of these sites for it. So it's one thing to say that you're going to do pollinators, but it's another thing is over the 21 or 30 years it's there, it's not maintained. And as a point in case, if you take a look at the budget for the stormwater folks, you'll see that they put $50,000 aside for maintenance on the stream restoration projects, which includes plantings and things of that sort. And the example that I wanted to use is the Greystone up in Tohono, where there was a stream restoration, and they in fact put in native plants. So that kind of takes me to the second thing, is that you know, Mr. Ribeiro is our landscape buffering guy. He's our expert. And it seems to me that when he reviewed the pivot farm and he saw the Kimberly horn piece, they had a planting piece. And you could go down through there and see that they were all native species. Now, if there's something more specific that we want, then instead of trying to figure out a condition or whatever, maybe it's better to make that part of the site review process, so that you get the maintenance and you get the right planning to the conditions that are there. Not only to a solar farm, but as Mr. Kraft added, to the buffering requirements for the Hertzler, as well as any of the bufferings that we have for the county corridors, as an example. So I'd like to see us kind of widen that out a little bit for it, but I think it may be appropriate, and I'd like to get staff's opinion on that in terms of a site review process as opposed to an ordinance or even a condition.
Yeah, so I think we have some really good opportunities. I was actually sharing earlier today, sort of my initial thought and gut reaction to that would be, gosh, what perfect timing, because we are already, as a staff and a planning commission and policy committee, already embarked upon a series of ordinance amendments designed to align our subdivision ordinance and zoning ordinance with the adopted 2045 comprehensive plan. And so certainly for this calendar, or this fiscal year rather, we're working on some already identified priorities. Sort of the subsequent year or two or 18 months or whatever it ends up being will give us the opportunities to look at the other districts and the other provisions of the code, including the landscape ordinance. And so, I think some of the consistency and conditions over the very short term, over these next 6 months or a year, I think staff can handle at a staff level. And I think as we get into looking at what might be desired updates to the landscape ordinance, which then also applies to both legislative and by right conditions, site plans and subdivisions, I think looking for those opportunities to very specifically dial in where we make use of native species and reinforcing those. It's stated as a goal. Now there's a lot of deference paid to the plan preparer, but certainly I think in terms of advancing some of those as a more regular understanding, be a really good opportunity to drop those in that, and that'll happen sooner than later.
And not to put too much of a fine point, the reason that I brought this up is there's a condition for a nutrient management plan, but there's nothing to say that the nutrient management plan doesn't include the maintenance. And I know that the Colonial Soil Water Conservation District, in partnership with the stormwater folks, do nutrient plans, but they also go out and re-look at them, and Whitehall is an example of that. So there's a monitoring piece to this thing that I think needs to be there, especially with the solar pieces for it. Thank you.
So, and again, just to kind of throw into that, just food for thought, as we, continue to evolve these types of things, again, gut reaction there, again, just for takeaway, and I'm sure we'll have lots of good opportunities for discussion. So there's really two elements there. There's sort of the statement of expectations about maintenance. Sometimes I think that could be hard, from my experience, to include in very high level general expectations on the front end. That's because there's so many unique characteristics about every single property, and at the end of the day, you want that maintenance to best match up to the very specific site characteristics that are being developed. And that goes to, yes, what type of ground cover has been spec'd? What does the final grading do? What's the stormwater doing? And so all that can certainly play. I think as we were able to articulate earlier on this other one, we do have the ability at the staff level to include and a lot of that document is boilerplate because it gives applicants a place to start. We could certainly build in from a boilerplate a section for maintenance. Ultimately then how that translates into having available staff resources to monitor it and the frequency of that's probably a whole separate, different conversation, but at least in terms of, having an applicant put in some forethought into what the appropriate maintenance can be and having that translation from the design engineer to the owner could be a good place to start.
And once again, if you go back and take a look at the last two solar farm pieces, is the county is getting, $91,000 over 31 years to do what it wants? Well, some of that money can be used for the maintenance piece as far as I'm concerned for it. And then, so the general services guys who have the responsibility to do the maintenance for the county, as well as we have the stormwater folks that have responsibility every 5 years to go look at these things. So if you're going to look had a solar farm with a pervious surface, and you have that, you have the responsibility to make sure it's functioning.
Just to add on, I agree with Frank's comments 100% about expanding. And, you know, even projects that don't come through the Planning Commission as a land use or site plan issue or whatever, the use of native grasses, trees, pollinators should be part of our culture in the county, whether it's a county project where you have to go and replenish a BMP planting. Just make it, you know, part of the given that it'll be native, and, you know, and that saves money too in the long run, because native plants are used to this climate here. They don't have to be irrigated as much. They provide habitat that some plants don't for, you know, birds and other animals. So just sort of make it part of the culture that we're just going to do that, even if a project doesn't need to go through the legislative review. Thank you all for your support on that, too.
Anybody else? So just real quick, three quick things. Mr. Haldeman, you have Board of Supervisors for next week. Great, thank you very much. In December, I'll be traveling, so Mr. Polster will be chairing the meeting for me, so enjoy. Hopefully it'll go a lot faster than when I chair. And finally, I would like to just express my appreciation to all of you all. You know, I represented the Planning Commission at October's board meeting, and there were a couple of comments made that I took a personal affront to, but I would like to reiterate something that Ms. Larson said, is that, you know, we all act independently, and we do our research, we do our homework, and, you know, we make a recommendation to the Board of Supervisors. So I appreciate that she made that comment. You know, I think that in some cases there's not a clear understanding to the community as to what we all do. So I just want to express my appreciation, because I know how much work goes into preparing for all of these meetings, and I appreciate the thoughtfulness and the independent decision making. So I think that's important to reinforce. And as we see tonight, you know, these cases, as James City County evolves with this latest comp plan and what we have in the PSA and the rural lands, you know, as we start to see infill development, and I think there were a few in Mr. Holt's latest application for some plans that are getting submitted that, you know, are you know, could potentially change more of the character of the community. And as we saw these applications tonight, these hearings are going to get more and more difficult to come up with decisions. So like I said, I just wanted to express my appreciation. I find that this body has, you know, always been passionate and does what I think is a fine job for the county. So thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So with that, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
To adjourn.
All in favor?
Aye.
We are adjourned.